Welcome to today's deep dive. I want you to take a second and think about that lingering ache in your knee.
Oh, yeah, the one that always flares up when you try to just push through a normal workout.
Exactly. Or maybe you have a colleague who couldn't find a single exercise routine that accommodated their body during pregnancy.
Right.
Or a friend trying to navigate the gym with scoliosis without ending up in, days of pain.
It's incredibly common. We all carry these entirely unique physical blueprints.
We do. Yet the modern fitness industry consistently treats human movement like a mass-produced commodity. We're handed these standardized templates and just expected to fit into them.
Regardless of our individual structural integrity.
Right. And okay, let's unpack this because that mismatch is the core problem we're looking at today. Our mission is to uncover the hidden science of how elite movement professionals actually rebuild and protect bodies that completely defy the standard fitness mold.
Which is such a critical topic right now.
It really is. And to do that, we are analyzing a highly advanced instructional manual. This is for the Injuries and Special Populations course.
The ISP course.
The ISP course, exactly. Designed for Stop Pilates instructors. And this material is linked to Caroline Berger de Fémynie, who is the founder of Studio Biopilates Paris.
And just reading through it, you realize immediately this isn't your typical fitness guide.
Not at all. It's a clinical masterclass in applied biomechanics and neuromuscular rehabilitation.
It really operates far beyond the scope of a traditional group fitness syllabus. Because frankly, the fitness industry is facing a crisis. We are currently navigating a massive demographic shift.
Oh, absolutely.
The data points to an increasingly aging population, rising rates of metabolic syndrome, and lifestyles defined by really sedentary habits. People are showing up to movement therapies carrying a complex web of physiological limitations.
And when a fitness program just ignores those specific guardrails?
We don't just see a lack of progress. We see secondary injuries. We see the severe exacerbation of underlying symptoms.
And then people just quit.
Exactly. A total psychological withdrawal from movement because the individual assumes their body is fundamentally broken.
Right, they blame themselves. And the manual aggressively critiques these gaps in standard care. Like, one of the most glaring failures it highlights is the total disregard for the specific phase of tissue healing.
Yes.
A traditional gym environment often treats, say, an acute ligament tear, a subacute muscle strain, and a chronic tendinopathy with the exact same broad stroke modifications.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Yeah.
There's this systemic failure to distinguish between absolute contraindications.
Meaning movements that will cause immediate structural failure.
Right. And relative contraindications,
Right.
where the load and the vector simply need precise management.
Which brings up the text's focus on the injury continuum. It makes it clear that tissue healing is a highly specific chronological cascade.
It is. Take the fibroblastic phase, for instance.
Right, that critical window.
Yeah, that's when the body is laying down new, highly disorganized collagen fibers to repair a tear. If an instructor throws a generic high-load routine at a client during this exact phase, they aren't just slowing down recovery.
They're actively tearing down the fragile scaffolding the body is trying to build.
Exactly. That mechanical disruption triggers a chronic inflammatory loop. It completely derails the neuromuscular integration required for the tissue to mature and align properly.
Leaving the tissue permanently vulnerable. But here's where it gets really interesting. Because to prevent that, the Stop Pilates ISP framework introduces a massive paradigm shift in how we analyze joint stability.
The dynamic interplay between forearm closure and force closure.
Yes. And understanding those two concepts fundamentally changes how you look at every movement you make. Let's use an architectural analogy for you listening. Just scale it to your body's biomechanics. Form closure is your passive stability.
Like a Roman arch.
Exactly, a Roman arch built with perfectly interlocking stone blocks. The actual physical geometry of the bones, how tightly they fit together, and the dense ligaments wrapping them that provides inherent stability without requiring any active energy.
The sacroiliac joint in the pelvis is the prime example of that.
Right. The sacrum and ilium wedge together so effectively that they can transfer immense upper body weight into the lower limbs through pure geometric design.
It's an incredibly efficient passive architecture. However, the human body is also designed for extreme mobility, and that requires joints with terrible form closure.
They just don't fit together tightly.
Right, which introduces force closure. This is dynamic, active stability. The glenohumeral joint, the shoulder, is the classic textbook example here.
The golf ball on a tee.
Exactly. The humeral head articulating with the glenoid fossa is just like a golf ball sitting on a tee. The inherent structural stability is almost non-existent.
So how does it stay in place?
To prevent the humerus from simply dislocating under gravity, the system relies entirely on the continuous active compression generated by the rotator cuff muscles. That active muscular bracing across the joint line is force closure.
So if a joint lacks the interlocking geometry of form closure, it is entirely dependent on the continuous tension of force closure to survive any load.
And if those muscles fatigue or misfire, structural failure is immediate.
Wow. Which really forces us to look at the hierarchy of the muscles providing that force closure.
And the manual spends a significant amount of time geeking out over this. They break down the distinction between global stability and segmental stability.
The heavy machinery versus the fine-tuners.
Right. They place a massive emphasis on what is clinically termed the inner unit.
I love this part.
We are looking at the deep local stabilizers, the transverse abdominis, the deep multifidus in the lumbar spine, the diaphragm, and the complex musculature of the pelvic floor.
So these are not your prime movers.
No, not at all. They do not generate torque for large sweeping actions. Their primary neurological function is to control the neutral zone.
The neutral zone being that minute range of physiological laxity, the microwobble that exists in a joint before the passive ligaments are pulled taut enough to offer resistance.
Yes, the microwobbles. If a person cannot control those microwobbles during dynamic movement, those tiny translation forces create shear stress on the joint surfaces.
And over thousands of repetitions, that unchecked shear stress manifests as microtrauma, cartilage degradation, and chronic pain.
Exactly. The neurological timing of the inner unit is what prevents that microtrauma. In a healthy biomechanical system, the transverse abdominis and multifidus have a feed-forward mechanism.
Meaning they fire before you even move.
Milliseconds before the central nervous system even signals the deltoids or the quadriceps to move a limb, the inner unit fires. They actively compress and secure the spinal segments and pelvic girdle, so the prime movers have a rigid base to pull against.
To put that into perspective for you listening, your global muscles, like your lats and glutes, are the heavy machinery doing the visible work. Your local muscles, the inner unit, are the invisible structural engineers ensuring the foundation doesn't crack under the payload.
Which highlights a massive logistical issue for the standard fitness industry.
Oh, totally. Because in a fast-paced 45-minute group class, instructors are almost exclusively programming for the heavy machinery.
They are targeting global fatigue.
But if the invisible engineers, the local stabilizers, are dysfunctional, strengthening the prime movers actually accelerates the destruction of the joint.
It is a recipe for catastrophic failure. And the manual brings this theoretical framework into stark reality through its clinical applications, specifically detailing how biomechanics radically shift during pregnancy.
Yeah, that section was eye-opening. We have to consider the profound impact of endocrinology on structural stability.
What's fascinating here is the introduction of the hormone relaxin. It completely rewrites the rules,
Because it targets the connective tissues.
specifically increasing the laxity of the ligaments to allow the pelvic ring to expand for childbirth. So returning to our earlier concepts, ligaments are the primary contributors to passive form closure.
Meaning the endocrine system is systematically dismantling the pelvis's interlocking architecture.
Exactly. The symphysis pubis and the sacroiliac joints become inherently hypermobile. Because the passive stability is compromised, the Stop Pilates instructor must immediately pivot the entire clinical strategy.
They have to artificially replace that lost form closure by drastically up-regulating force closure.
Yes, but carefully. The instructor has to cue the deep inner unit to actively compress the pelvic ring, but they are dealing with a system already under immense mechanical stress from the growing fetus.
Right, so the ISP manual strictly dictates the removal of compressive loads on the pelvic floor. It eliminates supine exercises, laying flat on the back.
And not just because of vena cava compression, which restricts blood flow.
Right, but because the biomechanical vector places inappropriate shear force on the lumbar spine and anterior pelvic ring.
So instead, the protocol shifts to seated, quadruped, or lateral side-lying positions. The instructors utilize props like the Swiss ball or foam roller to introduce an unstable base of support.
Which forces the central nervous system to constantly recruit those deep local stabilizers to maintain balance.
Exactly. Effectively training force closure through proprioceptive feedback rather than heavy external resistance loads that could damage the vulnerable ligaments.
It's such a brilliant way to modify the environment to safely rebuild stability. The next clinical application the text tackles is scoliosis.
which presents a completely different biomechanical puzzle.
It does. A common misconception is viewing scoliosis purely as a lateral deviation, a two-dimensional C or S curve in the spine.
And treating it as a two-dimensional issue is highly detrimental. Scoliosis is a complex, three-dimensional deformity.
Right.
It involves lateral curvature, yes, but it is driven by the axial rotation of the vertebral bodies.
Your spine is actually twisting.
Twisting, exactly. This rotation fundamentally alters the line of pull for every muscle attaching to the spine and ribcage. You end up with severe asymmetrical muscle tension.
So on the convex side, the outer aspect of the curve, the musculature and fascial lines are chronically overstretched, hypertoned, and mechanically disadvantaged.
While on the concave side, the inner aspect, the tissues are chronically shortened, compressed, and neurologically inhibited.
You essentially have this continuous asymmetrical tug-of-war across the entire axial skeleton.
Which is why programming symmetrical bilateral exercises like a standard barbell deadlift or a generic plank is a terrible idea. It forces the dominant, overstretched muscles to take over, which drives the spine further into the rotational deformity.
The ISP methodology counters this by implementing highly targeted asymmetrical 3D interventions. Instructors use specific spring tensions on the Pilates equipment combined with resistance bands and small rotational balls
to tactily stimulate the weak concave side. They're trying to wake up those inhibited mechanoreceptors while simultaneously attempting to derotate and lengthen the convex side.
And the manual details a secondary physiological consequence of that vertebral rotation that often goes totally unaddressed in standard fitness.
The alteration of the thoracic cavity.
Yes.
As the spine rotates, it drags the rib cage with it. This creates a rib hump on one side and compresses the ribs on the other. This physical distortion literally shrinks the available volume for lung expansion on the concave side.
It reduces their vital lung capacity, which makes breathwork a critical structural intervention in this specific Pilates methodology. They aren't using breathing merely as a mindfulness technique to lower cortisol.
No, they employ directed posterolateral breathing. The instructor cues the client to actively force air into the compressed concave side of the rib cage,
using the internal pressure of the expanding lungs to mechanically push the ribs outward.
To counteract the rotational deformity from the inside, using internal pneumatic pressure to mobilize the thoracic spine is a highly advanced technique.
It really is. And we see a similar level of precise intervention when the manual addresses joint degeneration, particularly hip osteoarthritis.
Osteoarthritis fundamentally changes the articular surfaces. The progressive loss of hyaline cartilage means the joint loses its smooth, low-friction glide.
But more importantly, cartilage depth contributes to the passive structural fit of the joint. Its degradation represents a significant loss of form closure.
And once again, when form closure degrades, the burden shifts entirely to force closure.
The objective of the Stop Pilates instructor is to stimulate the deep local musculature, like the gluteus medius and the deep lateral rotators of the hip, to actively centrate the head of the femur within the acetabulum.
They have to compress the joint to stabilize it, but they must do so without creating massive compressive forces that would grind the degraded cartilage and trigger an inflammatory flare-up.
This is where the specialized equipment becomes indispensable. The manual highlights the use of the reformer machine, specifically utilizing limited ranges of flexion.
By controlling the exact angle of the hip joint, the instructor ensures the shear forces stay within the tolerance of the damaged articular surfaces.
Plus, the spring-loaded resistance of the reformer provides assistance during the eccentric phase of the movement. This allows the client to highly stimulate the stabilizing muscles without the uncontrolled, gravity-driven impact forces you'd get in a standard gym.
It is the ultimate environment for controlled load management. And that same principle of precision applies to how the ISP course handles knee rehabilitation.
Especially during the vulnerable stages of ligament repair, like an ACL reconstruction, because the knee is a fascinating structural compromise.
It is. The femur and tibia don't have deep interlocking geometry. The joint relies almost exclusively on its ligamentous network, the ACL, PCL, MCL, and LCL, for passive form closure.
And the manual pays special attention to the biomechanics of the screw-home mechanism.
Right. In the final few degrees of terminal knee extension, the tibia externally rotates slightly on the femur,
locking the joint into its most stable, close-packed position,
relying heavily on the integrity of those ligaments. During the fibroblastic phase of healing, when a repaired ligament is highly disorganized and fragile, forcing the knee through that locking mechanism under an inappropriate load can permanently stretch the graft.
So to protect that vulnerable tissue while still maintaining muscle mass, the Stott protocol relies heavily on closed kinetic chain exercises.
For you listening, a closed kinetic chain movement means the distal end of the limb. The foot is fixed against a solid, unmoving surface.
On the reformer, this translates to footwork, where the client presses against a stationary foot bar while the carriage moves.
The physiological benefit of that closed chain environment is co-contraction. When the foot is fixed and driving force, the central nervous system fires the quadriceps on the front of the thigh and the hamstrings on the back simultaneously,
Creating a rigid, active brace.
pure force closure that stabilizes the tibia and completely unloads the healing ACL during the movement.
And only after the ligament has fully matured and integrated does the protocol introduce open chain exercises, like a seated leg extension, where the foot is free-floating and the shear forces across the knee joint increase exponentially.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean? We have dissected the cellular healing phases, the architectural balance of form and force closure, and the precise mechanical interventions for complex pathologies. But the manual introduces a vital paradigm shift in its final chapters.
It forces the practitioner to recognize that movement therapy cannot be separated from neurology and psychology.
The biomechanics are ultimately governed by the central nervous system's perception of threat.
The psychosocial factors of rehabilitation are often the most difficult to overcome. When a client experiences severe trauma or chronic pain, the central nervous system adopts a high-threat state.
This fear of movement, or kinesiophobia,
It drastically alters motor recruitment. The brain begins generating dysfunctional protective patterns. For example, if a hip joint is degraded and painful, the motor cortex will inhibit the glutes and over-recruit the quadratus lumborum in the lower back.
to hike the hip and avoid loading the painful joint.
Right.
And the insidious part of those protective patterns is that they outlast the initial tissue damage. Long after the acute inflammation in the hip has subsided, the brain continues to move the body with that altered, limping gait because the neural pathways associated with fear are still active.
Those compensatory mechanics then transfer abnormal shear forces to the lower back and the opposite knee, creating a cascading chain of secondary injuries.
Meaning the Stop Pilates instructor in the ISP framework must operate as a neurological facilitator.
They are not merely assigning repetitions to build hypertrophy. They are actively engaging in neuroplasticity.
They must dismantle those fear-based motor patterns and remap the motor cortex.
They utilize deep proprioceptive challenges, forcing the nervous system to feel safe in previously painful ranges of motion. They use highly specific tactile cueing, physically manipulating the tissue to draw the brain's sensory focus to a dormant local stabilizer.
Forcing the client to consciously reconnect with muscles the brain has actively inhibited.
It is the simultaneous rehabilitation of the structural hardware and the neurological software.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the ISP manual points to a profound evolution in the movement therapy profession. The text looks ahead to the integration of immersive technologies.
Yes, it discusses the imminent use of virtual reality and augmented reality as clinical tools.
Which is mind-blowing.
The integration of VR and AR will fundamentally alter how practitioners interact with human anatomy. Instructors will be able to visualize a client's specific three-dimensional scoliotic curvature or the exact degree of their hip joint degradation in real time.
Overlaying that data directly onto the client's physical movements.
But beyond the technological advancements, the manual underscores a necessary shift in the professional ecosystem. Elite Pilates instructors, armed with this level of biomechanical and neurological training, are migrating out of the boutique fitness space.
They're establishing themselves within integrated medical networks.
Collaborating directly with orthopedic surgeons, physical therapists, and neurologists, they are becoming the essential, long-term bridge between acute medical intervention and the safe return to complex functional human movement.
It completely redefines the entire scope of the practice. So, let's summarize the extensive ground we've covered today. We started by identifying the inherent dangers of the standard fitness industry's disregard for the specific phases of tissue healing and unique biomechanical limitations.
We explored the critical balance between our passive architectural stability form closure and our active muscular bracing force closure.
We examined how the Stop Pilates ISP framework applies these principles to rebuild stability during the hormonal shifts of pregnancy.
How it utilizes asymmetrical tension and internal pneumatic pressure to untangle the 3D rotation of scoliosis.
And how it manages shear forces to protect degenerating cartilage and healing ligaments. Finally, we uncovered the deep neurological connection between chronic pain, fear, and motor control, highlighting how specialized movement therapy must actively rewire the brain to restore safe mechanics.
I want to leave you with a concept to analyze regarding your own movement patterns. The next time you experience a sudden twinge in your lumbar spine or a feeling of deep instability in a joint when you shift your weight, critically evaluate what is happening beneath the surface.
Look deeper.
Is your system failing because the passive architecture, your form closure, is structurally compromised? Or has your central nervous system simply lost the ability to recruit the inner unit to provide active force closure?
It's a crucial distinction.
When you choose to ignore the pain and push through a generic workout, are you actually strengthening the tissue, or are you deeply ingraining dysfunctional, fear-based protective patterns that will ultimately lead to a more catastrophic structural failure?
A vital perspective to consider before you load a barbell or step onto a treadmill. Your body is a profoundly complex, highly adaptable biomechanical system, and it requires precise, educated management. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Stop Pilates ISP manual and the clinical science of movement. We hope this arms you with a deeper understanding of your own structural integrity and the true requirements of neuromuscular rehabilitation. Catch you next time.